So the purpose of this video is going to be to talk about all of the things that will shift aggregate demand. So to go ahead and start off, I'm just going to really quickly draw an aggregate supply and demand diagram. So we have the price level over here, and then we have real GDP over here, and this will hopefully be review from the last video. And then we have this slopey line that we call aggregate supply that hits this wall, as I was calling it in the last video, right here at long run aggregate supply or full employment GDP, and I'll just put FEGDP. And there's other names for it, but those are the two that I've heard most commonly. And then we're going to have aggregate demand here, and I'm just going to draw two aggregate demand lines. So I'll draw AD1, and then in blue I'll draw AD2. And so now we're going to talk about the things that will shift aggregate demand and then how they will shift aggregate demand. So here on this side we have the change, and I've written out all of the changes that I have seen on any entry-level economics, macroeconomics exam. And really this is the list that contains every single thing that I can think of that would shift aggregate demand. I couldn't think of any extras. And then we're just going to go and walk through what the change in aggregate demand will be. So an increase in taxes is going to make every person have less money in their pocket. So this is an increase in taxes without any change in government spending. So just all of a sudden we increase taxes. So everyone is going to have less money, and so holding everything else equal, aggregate demand is going to go down because people have less money to spend. So this will be a decrease in aggregate demand, and I'm going to go ahead and write all these with green. So this will be a decrease in aggregate demand for an increase in taxes. You know what? I'm not going to write these in green. I'm going to do these in red, and then we'll go ahead and do something else in green. So this will be a decrease in aggregate demand for an increase in taxes. Now if we have a decrease in taxes, then we will have an increase in aggregate demand. And the thought process there is that if we have less taxes, everyone has more money to spend, so we'll go spend more money, and that will increase aggregate demand. So taxes work in an inverse direction. If taxes go up, aggregate demand goes down. If taxes go down, aggregate demand goes up. Alright, so what about business investment? Well, if businesses are investing, that means that there's going to be more demand for all of the things that they are investing in. So they're investing in things like factories, which have to get built, so that will be an increase in aggregate demand. So an increase in business investment leads to an increase in aggregate demand, and then a decrease in business investment leads to a decrease in aggregate demand for the same kind of reason. Now an increase in government spending. Well, if the government is spending more, whether it be on healthcare or defense or, I don't know, infrastructure, no matter what the government is spending money on, someone has to build it and someone has to get paid for it. So an increase in government spending, holding everything else equal, will lead to an increase in aggregate demand, just because the government's spending more. And then a decrease in government spending will lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. And this is one of the ideas behind the stimulus bill that went into effect in, I think it was 2008, maybe it was 2009, but it was to increase government spending so that we could raise aggregate demand and kind of get the economy kick-started back on track again. That was kind of the thought process. So what about an increase in the GDP of foreigners? Or another way of saying this is income of foreigners. Well, foreigners, like let's talk about the Eurozone, they buy a lot of our products. So if they have more money, their income increases, they're going to buy more of our products, which will also increase aggregate demand for our nation. So that will lead to an increase in aggregate demand. And likewise, if there is a decrease in GDP of foreigners, then there will be a decrease in aggregate demand. And that's what we're hearing about right now with the Eurozone crisis, is that their GDP is plummeting so quickly, and it's really not plummeting that much, but it's just not growing as fast as they would like. So we hear that their GDP is dropping, and so they have less demand, and we hear this talk of the recession coming back over the Atlantic, or the recession crossing the pond. And so that's exactly the kind of idea that we're talking about right here. where if the income of foreigners decreases, they will have less money to buy our products, and that will cause an increase in aggregate demand here, which will lead to a lower level of GDP. Alright, so an increase in consumer confidence. Everyone just magically decides they want to spend more. So this will lead to an increase in aggregate demand because everyone's spending more. So people are demanding more and they want to buy more stuff. And likewise, a decrease in consumer confidence will lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. And then this last one is kind of tricky. It always gets me mixed up, to be completely honest. And that's an appreciation of the dollar. So the dollar gets stronger, is what that means, which means that you need less dollars for one, and I put for foreign currency, I put euros here. So you need less dollars per euro, or you need, the other way of saying this is that you need more euros for every dollar. So this means that American goods are now more expensive. So rather than writing American, I'll write USA. USA is more expensive. So an appreciation of the dollar leads to a decrease in aggregate demand for American goods because our goods are now more expensive relative to, say, Chinese goods. And so that's why you hear about the talk of the Chinese are keeping their yuan, or their, other people call it the renminbi, artificially low, and that's why they have such great trade, is that they're fixing their currency. So that's the kind of argument that's going on here. So they're saying that they're keeping the currency artificially low, which is exactly what we're going to talk about here. So if there's a depreciation of the dollar, whoops, hold on one second. So if there is a depreciation of the dollar, then that will lead to an increase in aggregate demand. And that's because the depreciation of the dollar makes the USA, the American-made goods, cheaper. And since they're cheaper, more people are going to want to buy them, and that will lead to an increase in our aggregate demand. So hopefully that is a good overview of all the things that cause a shift in aggregate demand. If there's something that was mentioned in your class that I didn't mention here, please let me know, and I'll make a new video and include it, but I think that that's a pretty exhaustive list.